All right, here we are for part 2 of the card. Mine and Tony's top 12, really, if we include the honorable mentions. Matches, not necessarily our best matches, but matches that we really wanted to talk about here today. And we are up to our number 3. My number 3 is a match from Nitro in 1998, September of 1998. Billy Kidman versus Juventud Guerrera for the Cruiserweight Championship. This was one heck of a TV match. One of those classic Cruiserweight matches. And these two have had matches a million times just on Nitro. But this was when, for me, Kidman was becoming peak Kidman with the tank top and the jorts that he would wear all the time. And at this point, he didn't even have his ring music yet. That was low-key one of my favorite ring entrance music themes of all time. He didn't even have that yet because he had just left the Flock. The Flock had just been broken up, Raven's Flock. And he was just breaking away from that. He was kind of the leader of what was being broken away. And he's obviously getting a little bit of a push here. But him and Juventud always had great chemistry. Juventud was Cruiserweight champion coming into this. And they just had this fantastic match on Nitro that blew the roof off the place. You can see how over Kidman is. The finish of the match is Juventud going for his 450 splash. He misses, which sets Kidman up, and then Kidman goes up to the top rope for his shooting star. And that everyone in the building just gets on their feet because they know it's coming. And he hits that shooting star splash perfectly on the Juventud. Gets the 3. He's the new Cruiserweight champion. And he doesn't even have his own ring music yet. Perry Saturn comes out, who had also just left the Flock, and gives him an ovation. The crowd's going nuts. You've seen this match, you said pretty recently, actually. What do you think of this match?
Yeah. You know, in my personal opinion, I believe this is the match that made WWE open its eyes to having potentially smaller guys on their program on a weekly basis. It wasn't too long after this match that you saw the rise of groups like Kai and Tai and Crash Holly with his absolutely ridiculous hardcore championship reign. I feel like this match was the standard bearer for what we know as cruiserweight wrestling today. And even though prior to this you had guys like Rey Mysterio doing it, this match right here showed that there was a want to see guys who weren't exactly in Vince McMahon's big sweaty man bear.
Yeah, and WWF/WWE, even to this day, still has never fully leaned to. And today's a little bit different. You've got, cruiserweights are world champion holders now a lot of the times, and that's perfectly acceptable and fine. This is at a time when heavyweights and light heavyweights/cruiserweights, there was still a distinction between them. Chris Jericho was in this cruiserweight division and would never have been thought of as a world title holder at that point in time. But, yeah, certainly at this point, that Cruiserweight title had already gotten quite a bit of play in the undercard of Nitro for a couple of years. Rey Mysterio has had it. Eddie Guerrero had it. I think Jericho by this point had it. So, and now here we are with Juventud and, giving it on to Kidman. And just a fantastic match. Like you said, there was another match I was going to put into this place. And it was a Rey Mysterio Jr. versus Kidman match that would take place after this for the WCW title that would go to a 15-minute draw. That was absolutely fantastic. Probably, and I mentioned this to you before we started recording, probably the match that got me as a wrestling fan. Before that, I enjoyed the show. I had only started watching wrestling early in 98, very late in 97. This was the first one that made me go, oh no, I actually like the wrestling. as much as I, if not more than I like the stories behind it and the false finishes. That match, but this is an even better match, and over time, this is the one that's kind of stuck out to me a little bit more. This one, I was also thinking Rey Mysterio versus Eddie Guerrero at Halloween Havoc. Absolute banger of a match that everyone remembers. Just got mentioned on WWE TV recently with the with Rhea Ripley's return at that anniversary for Rey Mysterio when his costume for that match was in the package, was gifted to him. But this match is probably a little more low key. But if you haven't seen it, you need to go back and watch it. September 14th, 1998, Nitro. Go on Peacock. Look up this match. It's absolutely fantastic.
And another thing, real quick, just to tell you how significant it is now that we have cruiserweights posing as, or that have the potential to become world champions. The cruiserweight division is classified anything 205 pounds and lower. AJ Styles walks around at 204 pounds. AJ would technically be considered a cruiserweight, but it's nowadays absolutely absurd to envision AJ Styles not in that world championship, U.S. championship picture.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about. I think because they would talk about Jericho. I know there's a whole run with Jericho as a heel, and he had to get under. He was probably over the weight limit for the cruiserweight division, but he would do some heel things to act like he actually. I think the limit was 205 pounds, if I'm not mistaken, something like that. All right, we will go to your number 3 match, which is absolutely a banger in a Hell in a Cell match at WrestleMania 28 with Shawn Michaels as a special guest referee. The Undertaker versus Triple H, end of an era. Why is this your number 3?
Because when you really think about it, this match was the end of an era. You had Triple H getting ready to shave his head and transition into more of a backstage role, moving into more of an Undertaker role at that too, because the only time around this point where you'd see Triple H as a performer would be around WrestleMania time, on the road to WrestleMania, trying to figure out who Triple H is going to be competing against that year at WrestleMania. This is when the Undertaker was getting ready to become more of a part-timer, once a year kind of figure, especially knowing that 2 years later you're going to be heading into the streak finally being broken at WrestleMania 30. Shawn Michaels at this point had already stepped away from full-time in-ring competition. I actually believe that he stepped away altogether. This was the last stand of the toxic backstage locker room, things that have been noted recently in interviews. On top of that, too, you had the storyline going into this is absolutely where the Undertaker is going to have the streak be lost. Shawn Michaels, DX partner with Triple H. But then the seeds of dissent started being planted where Triple H couldn't really trust Shawn Michaels going into this. This is also the first time in modern history of WWE where the Undertaker didn't really have no grand entrance into WrestleMania. It was very just straightforward, him coming out with the hood on. The Hell in a Cell itself even had theme music for WrestleMania. It was Metallica, if I remember correctly. A lot of bizarre coincidence. The great brawling outside of the ring up next to the steel cage. Shawn being hesitant to get in the middle of it. Even at times where the Undertaker would grab a hold of Shawn and shove him out. Instead of getting involved, Shawn would walk away and just kind of, take a breather and come back. And that's when the hardware gets into play. The infamous steel steps with the sledgehammer spot, the Hell's Gate, as you're showing now, on top of the stairs. Just this match, to me, embodied everything that was the Attitude Era going to the wayside and making room for moments to take place from the Ruthless Aggression era and the era that we now have today.
Yeah, I got to see this match pretty recently, about 6 or 8 weeks ago. I had it randomly playing as I was setting up, I think, for one of our live streams. And I ended up stopping what I was doing and ended up just watching the match because it's just so good. It just drew me in. And Shawn Michaels, who at this point had been retired for 2 years after his match with Taker at 26, he was fantastic as the referee role, his facials, his storytelling here in this match, and just the destruction that these two guys are doing to each other, and his reactions to it, and how happy he was. And then, of course, on the stage afterwards, which was supposedly a completely improvised moment, involved three of them arm in arm on the stage afterwards, which is absolutely fantastic and tear-inducing as well.
Yeah, we go into that conversation of iconic images from professional wrestling in the last 30 years. That image of them on top of the ramp, three of them supporting each other up, man, it just... If watching that match and how it ends doesn't do something for you in here, you have no fucking heart, and I don't know what 100%. To tell you.
All right, we will move on to our number twos. My number two is AJ Lee versus Kaitlyn for the Divas Championship at Payback 2013, June of 2013. This match is long before any women's revolution or evolution. This is even before the NXT was having their fantastic women's match. I think you had Charlotte and Natalya at the first takeover. Wouldn't be for another year or 11 months yet. But I think this match really is what started the ball rolling on getting to some of those women's matches that would actually have time on shows, and they would be able to actually tell a really good story. This is very important, I think, to the evolution of women's wrestling, especially in WWE, to what it is today. Before this, it was just comedy spots for your piss break match between what they thought were the good matches on the card. And this was definitely a transition away from that. What do you think of this match?
I think you're absolutely right. You hit the nail right on the head there. This was the start of what we would later know as the women's evolution in professional wrestling. The storyline, I will admit, has escaped me to an extent. Watching so much wrestling over this last week to kind of prepare for this. But from what I do recall, this was like AJ Lee's fanfare push, wasn't it?
Well, she was the big heel. This was at a time when AJ was still with Dolph Ziggler and Big E Langston. Yeah.
Big E Langston.
And Dolph at this point was kind of getting that big... He was world champion now, and he'd kind of been turned babyface by the fans, and he was working Alberto Del Rio. In fact, it's later on this card when he had that match against Alberto Del Rio where he got the concussion and would be out for a while, and that kind of screwed up, ended his run, unfortunately, a little early. But leading into this match, the story... I mean, it was still... They had a little ways to go. It was still a WWE Divas storyline of, Kaitlyn was in the ring, and she'd be getting these secret admirer messages from someone. And she went out to the ring, and she's like, okay, who's my secret admirer? They said they'd meet me here tonight. And out comes Big E Langston, right? And he's got flowers, and... he comes out to the ring, and he grabs her, and she looks really into it, and he leans her down and goes in to kiss her and then just drops her. And AJ Lee's music plays, and, so it was that emotional kind of BS women's story. It still had the time, but the emotion was there. There was a story at all, which was really good, and it did play into the match really well, and AJ Lee would go over Kaitlyn here. again, they told a great story within the match that complemented the story they were telling around it, and that Caitlyn really was emotionally compromised here and just wanted to really beat up AJ Lee to the point where she had AJ Lee beat and was like, nope, I'm not done with her. And that ended up coming back to cost her the match where AJ Lee would get her Black Widow submission move on her and AJ Lee or Caitlyn would have to tap out. The WWE fans weren't exactly caught up on women's wrestling at the time either yet. Caitlyn was the clear babyface in this, and she's crying and emotional after the match, and they're just booing the hell out of her. They're like, oh, female emotions, boo. Which, not exactly the best look for the WWE Universe today. But, they had some... they had built the WWE Divas division to be this thing to be laughed at and mocked up to this point anyway. So it was going to take some time to, I think, catch the audience up. And they have done that. But this was the first step, and it's such a good match, and a thing you really need to go back and watch on Peacock. All right, that'll lead us into your number 2. Cody versus Nick Aldis for the NWA Championship at All In. The precursor to AEW promotion. This was an independent card. There was no actual... Ring of Honor kind of co-promoted it, mostly on the production side with their equipment and their staff. But otherwise, this was a show put on in an arena and a sellout at that by Cody Rhodes and the Young Bucks. And this was basically your main event, Cody versus Aldis for the NWA title. Why is this your number 2?
All right, well, I'm going to correct you. This was definitely not the main event. This was actually the middle of the card. Let me set the stage for you. People were wondering after the success of Supercard of Honor selling out Madison Square Garden. Actually, I think it was a little bit before that. So people were asking if New Japan could sell out 10,000 seats.
I remember it was very specifically a tweet by Meltzer saying there's no way an independent show could sell this many seats or whatever.
Yes.
And Cody said, I'll take that bet. And I think it was a year or something later they had this pay-per-view.
Yeah, the tickets for this event when they were released sold out in 37 minutes. Just think about the magnitude of an independent, not even a real promotion, just names coming from the Bullet Club, putting something together to sell something out in 37 minutes that was over 10,000 seats. So at that point, pie in your face, Dave Meltzer. The backstory going into this was Cody was the ROH champion, but he didn't have the belt. Instead, he wore the ring, which is the Pontificus for MJF's ring that he has now. Nick Aldis was doing his 20 matches in 20 countries in 20 days. At the time being the NWA champion. He was trying to bring that title back to prominence.
I would think. And this match was a big part of it.
And for me, the beginning of this storyline was the first time that I saw Nick Aldis since he was Magnus back in TNA. The leader of a little group called the British Invasion. My how times has changed. Nick Aldis coming into this actually dwarfing Cody in size, which was incredible. Again, if this is your first time seeing Nick Aldis in quite some time. The beginning of the match, you would be remiss not to talk about the two sides that come out with each man. Coming out with Cody, a part of the Nightmare family, was Tommy Dreamer, obviously inspired by Dusty so much. Diamond Dallas Page, Glacier. If you don't remember Glacier, he had the Sub-Zero gimmick in WCW. And, of course, his father-in-law and his brother-in-law. And the one member of this that got the biggest pop of the night out of everything that had happened, Pharaoh.
Right.
Coming out with Nick Coming out with Nick Aldis was a who's who of NWA champion holders. You had Double J Jeff Jarrett. You had Tim Storm. Gosh, right now I'm blanking on all the other names, but I had to write them down. Just so many impactful people with history in the NWA championship. Now, full disclosure, even though this match was really good, the reason this match had so much vested interest into me is probably top 3 favorite wrestlers of my grandfathers who I grew up watching, ergo because of that, was Dusty Rhodes. There is so much history with the Rhodes name in the NWA championship that it would only make sense for Cody to want to fulfill his father's legacy by finally becoming the NWA champion. And this match was so incredible in just not only the action that happened in the ring and how simplistic everything was, but paying homage to NWA championship matches that came prior to that, and paying homage to professional wrestlers that each individual wrestler looked up to. There was a spot in the match where Nick Aldis did that famous British Bulldog running power slam to Cody on the outside. You had Cody taking moves from Randy Orton and Ted Jr. Throughout the match. There were little nuanced things like that happen. And of course, you can't have an NWA championship match without paying homage to Ric Flair, Cody getting some real good color on the outside. And then everything to the finish. The finish wasn't anything real fancy. Nick Aldis tried a sunset flip, to which Cody countered by just sitting down on top of him, getting the 1, 2, 3. Very emotional, as you see right here, end of the match. Cody actually receiving the NWA championship. Earl Hebner.
Yeah.
Earl goddamn Hebner refereed this match. And when he handed that belt to Cody and he flipped it for him to make sure that Cody knew he was going to be holding that title the right way for his first time holding it, dude, this match just hit you in the feels and was good for all the right reasons.
This match was a bit of a precursor to the Cody Dustin match that we talked about earlier. Earl Hebner refereed that match as well. But yeah, this was the first time I knew Billy Corgan had bought an NWA or the NWA and was kind of running it. But I wasn't even aware that the NWA title, which is ridiculous because they were using that belt in TNA, the early NWA TNA days, but I didn't realize that they were still using the Harley Race 10 pounds of gold belt until I saw that image of Cody from this pay-per-view of Cody crying and holding onto it, a belt that his father had won, which was made me go, oh, I gotta go watch that match and see what happened there. And you know, for those that to go a little bit further into that, the whole NWA/WCW title had a little bit of a complicated history. The NWO title kind of became the WCW International title, which was then unified with the WCW title once the NWA kind of broke away from WCW. So, but that WCW title always claimed the history of the NWA Championship, and even further on, the WWE World Heavyweight Championship, the big gold belt, would claim the history of that belt. So there's always been a disputed history and disputed claim of the NWA World Heavyweight Championship there. But that's what got me, was that belt and Cody Rhodes holding that belt. The image of that at the end of this match that I saw, I had to go, oh, I have to see this. And it was an absolutely fantastic match. Absolutely deserving of your number 2 spot for sure.
You know, and just to put this in perspective, anybody who was a wrestling fan throughout the 90s, there's 2 images of the NWA World Heavyweight Championship that everybody seems to recall. Number 1 being Shane Douglas winning the NWA Championship in ECW and saying that this is a relic of the past,
right,
it's bullshit, and throwing the belt in the trash. Then the next time you see it is a few years later in WWE, of all places. Dan Severn was working for WWE, the UFC, and the NWA
Yeah.
all at the same time. Just recently, I went back and watched the first few UFCs on ESPN Plus, and Dan Severn actually comes out to the Octagon. I believe is either UFC 3 or UFC 4 with the NWA Championship. After that, you don't see it again until Jeff Jarrett's holding it in TNA, and then you had many greats like Samoa Joe, Christopher Daniels, AJ Styles, all holding the NWA Championship. But to me, it never really seemed complete again until you saw it with Nick Aldis, and you saw what Billy Corgan was doing. And then once it was in the hands of Cody, because it is Cody on this list, because at the time WWE owned the Rhodes name, and how fucking petty they were. They wouldn't let Cody use the name Rhodes, but they let Brandy use the name Rhodes.
Well, I think it was the Cody Rhodes name in its entirety. It's weird and complicated.
Yeah.
Obviously, we talked about Cody versus Dustin, and they billed it as Cody versus Dustin, not Cody versus Dustin Rhodes. So Dustin Rhodes was still using the Rhodes name. But that was also more story reasons. You want the simplicity of just brother versus brother, Cody versus Dustin. But that's a whole separate thing. But yeah.
But nonetheless, the NWA title, while it rose to prominence with Nick Aldis being the champion and the hell of a job he did with it, something seemed right about that title being back in the hands of another Rhodes.
And you talk about the title sort of disappearing. It was still getting defended, and it was still around in the independents. There was still an NWA per se. No one cared at all. And you talked about Dan Severn in that time period. That was when they were doing that NWA invasion led by Cornette on WWF TV that really ended up going nowhere. It was kind of dumb, but that was meant to be a vehicle for Jeff Jarrett, who was the NWA North American champion, I believe, at the time, and they were pushing that. That was just to have him have a belt to push as a heel, but it just didn't really work all that well and was dropped pretty quickly. But yeah, this match you definitely need to go back and see if you haven't watched it. That will take us to our number one picks for the card here. My number one pick, that is a match I think you really need to see for the history. Speaking of the NWA title, Kerry Von Erich versus Ric Flair for the NWA Championship at Parade of Champions, May 6, 1984. And this match, there's a lot of rumors surrounding Kerry's state going into the match, but it's still a really good match. Kerry and Flair would have a lot of matches. This was Kerry's only run as world champion, though. He wouldn't hold it for very long. He would lose it again to Flair shortly after this, I believe in a steel cage, if I'm not mistaken. But this was, of course, not too long after David Flair's untimely passing in Japan. And this was sort of the memorial show at Texas Stadium, an absolutely humongous crowd for a territory, one of the biggest ever for World Class, for Dallas. And this match was the main event. Kerry would go over and win the world title here. Tears running down everyone's face, everyone crying because of the emotions of the moment. What are your thoughts on this match? I know you've seen it. What do you think of Kerry and Flair here?
Well, first off, anything Von Erich and Flair is always going to be good. The emotion behind this match, you have Kerry Von Erich, the Von Erich name weighing so heavily in the state of Texas that to this day, Lacey Von Erich, every time she's wrestled in Texas before she quit wrestling, although not that good, still Von Erich still got massive pops. You just think about the amount of people, like the crowd that you're looking at right now in this image. Back then, that was almost unheard of, being able to fill a stadium of that size. This is pre-WrestleMania, pre-this being in anybody's head of how big you could actually go with wrestling.
And to be clear, it's not, they didn't fill the entire stadium. It was Texas Stadium in Dallas or in Fort Worth. They had the ring in one of the end zones, and you can see there, like how full that is.
Yeah.
That's the horseshoe right there in one of the end zones. And if you see a shot from the other end of the end zone is fairly empty. But as you get closer to the ring, and even the upper decks, the nosebleeds of the stadium are packed. It's absolutely, and you can kind of see there, you get further away from the ring to the right, it gets a little empty, but they're jam-packed in that stadium, closer to the ring.
Absolutely.
And, there you see the 10 pounds of gold belt right there that Kerry is holding up and displaying. Just such an incredible match. Again, not the easiest thing to find on the network / Peacock. The match took place. This is before the days of pay-per-view. This wasn't even closed circuit. This was just a stadium show. You go there to see it live. They obviously recorded it, and they played it on their studio show, I believe May 18th, so a little over a week later or 2 weeks later. If you go back onto Peacock and you look up World Class Championship Wrestling, I think you have to go to the May 18th 84 show, and they play this match on it. And the tape, by the way, isn't very great. There are some issues with the Peacock version. It's the best version you're probably going to find, but there are issues with it. It's not the greatest quality. There are some skips in it and this and that. But Peacock, the network, will warn you, hey, this is the best copy available, but there are some issues with it. But definitely a match you need to go back and see. Again, it's a typical Ric Flair match, and that's the finish, by the way. It's a backslide. Flair would be counted out down for the 3 count right there. And, of course, once he gets that 3, just the entire stadium explodes. It's such a thing to watch. Go back and watch that match if you've never seen it.
And, going into that history being Kerry's only championship reign, just adds credence to how awesome it was seeing the new Von Erichs on Ric Flair's last match pay-per-view against the Briscoes, which was another.
Yeah, it was a thing you and I had messaged about before. Like, I think I said something to you. It just the Briscoes versus the Von Erichs as a match. Like, is it 1982 again? What's going on here? But yeah, so which absolutely was fitting for Ric Flair's last match. And for those of you that don't know, I want to go into it just a little bit here. The Von Erichs, like you mentioned briefly about how big they were in Texas. Like, you can't underestimate. You can't overestimate just how huge the Von Erich family was in Texas, especially Dallas, Texas, and that area and that promotion and territory. They were bigger than the Beatles.
With that said,
like, they were huge.
Yes.
Huge. And that cannot be overstated, just how big they were in that territory.
And not to spend a lot of time on it, but if you want to know also the extremely heartbreaking and tragic side of the Von Erich family, I highly suggest Dark Side of the Ring Season 2. They did an amazing piece on... They even had Kerry in it.
Kevin.
To discuss everything that happened with the Von Erich. Kevin, my bad. Kevin. They had Kevin in it. It's all the case. It gets me confused. They have Kevin in it. He goes into great detail, more than he's ever publicly gone into detail about everything that happened
Kevin
with the Von
being
Erich
the last
family.
surviving brother of that family. Absolutely heartbreaking. The Dark Side of the Ring, and even the WWE documentary Triumph and Tragedy of World Class Championship Wrestling, which is on the Peacock, is also excellent.
Ooh, I'm going to check that out.
They don't shy away from a lot of the tragedy of that as well. Obviously, they don't dive as deep as Dark Side of the Ring, but still, they don't shy away from it either. And Kevin is also a big part of that documentary as well. Very good documentary. It came out. That was when they were doing their run. They had the ECW documentary, and then they had the Rise and Fall, and then they had the Rise and Fall WCW, and I think shortly after that they did the World Class one, and it was really good, and it is on Peacock. All right, that'll take us to the last match we'll talk about today. Tony, your number one match. Speaking of ECW One Night Stand in 2006, RVD versus John Cena for the WWE Championship. Why is this your number one?
All right, so before I get into this, I would like to say this was absolutely a different time in what the culture of our nation was. For as one of the reasons why we were shitting on, well, why I was shitting on Peacock so hard. Remember with the WWE Network, you used to be able to type in a match, it would just take you to that match. That feature is not available with Peacock. You also can't just pick a pay-per-view and go to the match in the timetable on the bottom. So with that, you have to fast forward to get to the point that you want to get to within that pay-per-view to watch a match. And this morning I wanted to refresh myself a little bit. I wanted to watch this match again because I made this list, but I wanted to see if this match was as good as I remember it being. There were 3 different cards in the beginning of this that warned you how explicit this pay-per-view is, and for good reason, because of a spot that I completely fucking forgot about in a match that was prior to the John Cena RVD match. There was 2 different occasions where Edge had Beulah McGillicuddy once simulating oral sex on him, and the pin where he literally humped a passed out woman with her legs in the air. Different time. Also, they did the video package for this match, thinking that we were going right into this match, but no, the introduction for RVD is interrupted by none other than Eugene. For those of us who don't recall, Eugene was the mentally challenged nephew of Eric Bischoff, to where, granted, this is an ECW crowd. ECW fans are fucking ruthless. So they are literally booing a mentally challenged man in the center of a ring as he tries to read a poem to the ECW audience in which he loves ECW. And the hero in all of this that happened before the match even begins is a cigarette-smoking, beer-swilling, Singapore cane-wielding Sandman who comes into the ring and literally canes the ever-loving dog shit out of this man. We get our introduction from Rob Van Dam, who is over like Rover, obviously ECW original, in the Hammerstein Ballroom in New York. And then out comes John Cena, and I've never heard somebody be so detested and booed in my entire life as John Cena was coming into this. A sign that now gets fucking parodied at every big feud pay-per-view, I feel like now, was the sign from the Raptor that said, if Cena wins, we riot. This happened in 2006. I'm a freshman going into my sophomore year of high school. This was like the first pay-per-view of the summer, so me and my friends were at my house, staying up late, watching this, because this was a TVMA pay-per-view, so WWE had put it on later than normal. You can actually see a glimpse of that sign behind RVD in this picture. But the ECW crowd did not disappoint. They made it feel like if John Cena were to go over in this match, they were legitimately going to tear the arena apart. There was a part in the beginning where John Cena gets introduced and he does his, infamous throw my shit into the crowd, where I think it was no less than 7 minutes of John Cena throwing his shirt into the crowd throwing it back at John Cena. And he tried to throw it every which way possible to the point where he literally just said, fuck it, and started the match with the shirt being thrown back into the ring.
Which became a little bit of a trend, to throw it back, with him. Yeah. Yeah.
Which is something that we saw just recently on Dynamite, where Penta's mask got ripped off and the fans started chanting, throw it back, throw it back. This match had everything you'd expect out of your average ECW match, even though you had Joey Styles reminding you every 5 minutes that this is the first time the WWE Championship's being defended under Extreme Rules on ECW. Yeah, they kind of pimped that to death. But the cool part is the finish for me. This is height of my teenage angst. So the threat of constant, legit violence was exciting to me. The match was amazing. You had RVD, who is a competitor like no other, versus a once-in-a-generation talent like John Cena for the biggest prize of them all. You're not expecting John Cena to drop the title, especially not the RVD. But then he had some help from a man wearing a trench coat and a biker helmet, being Edge, coming in, spearing John Cena in the middle of the match. That helped RVD pick up the pinfall. And all of a sudden, now you have RVD as your new WWE champion, coming onto the heels of ECW now being on Sci-Fi, which is a fucking disaster that I don't even want to talk about right now. The only question that after this match was, what could have been? We all know shortly after this match taking place, RVD and Sabu. I mean, RVD is on brand for what happened. Gets caught in a car with Sabu higher than pigeon tits. And Vince McMahon and the WWE, being a public traded company at this time, had no choice but to strip RVD of that title. And he never really rose back into prominence the way you think RVD could have.
That's the one glaring thing. There's so many parallels between this match, I think, and the Cena Punk match at Money in the Bank that I was on my list earlier. Mm-hmm. The reaction to Cena coming out, just like you could say this one or that one. I think this one Cena got even more boos, which is Cena in Chicago against Punk is hard to top, but this one was even more so at the Hammerstein Ballroom. And obviously, this one doesn't quite have the historical significance, unfortunately, because of what happened with RVD a few days later and Sabu and that charge that he would catch. But just in the moment, yeah, it's every bit as impactful, I think, as that CM Punk match at Money in the Bank. It's tremendous. You don't expect RVD to win, yet in hindsight, how they go another direction, there's no way Cena's getting out of that building alive. He's got that kind of heat.
No.
So it's fantastic. And of course, Paul Heyman counting the 3 is also fantastic. Yeah, just such a good match and really fun. Really fun. I've never been an ECW guy. I never was. I watched WCW and then transitioned into the WWF as WCW started to suck. ECW was on TNN, and a couple of times I turned it on and I just had no interest in it. But this was obviously a really fun singular pay-per-view for WWE to put on. I'm sure Paul Heyman was on cloud 9 there. It looks like he was. And a great little show where just anything WWE, it didn't matter that it was Eugene. Anything WWE was going to get booed the fuck out of. And that was great. It was fun to see. It was a fun watch. The match, the entire show was a fun watch.
And and the thing for me is I grew up in the Northeast. I remember going to ECW shows at the Blair County War Memorial. Yes, they still ran shows at places like War Memorials and bingo halls. That is why ECW is referred to as the bingo hall promotion that could. But I think the reason why this hit number 1 is because ECW is such a huge part of my childhood, being from the same state that ECW started in, that it was cool to see it get its comeuppance and its ride off into the sunset, because let's face it, ECW on Sci-Fi was a bullshit way for Sci-Fi Network to plug whatever weird shit they had going on in the network and the wrestling programming. The Hardcore Justice pay-per-view, where TNA tried to do this exact same thing, just they couldn't use the name ECW, was absolute bullshit, other than the fact that they got Tech-9 to remix Riot Maker, which is one of my favorite songs for that pay-per-view. And then, of course, you have your hardcore homecomings and things like that, which, grand scheme of things now, is just absolutely fucking depressing, thinking of the number of people in this picture alone who are no longer with us. So yeah, this was the end all be all ECW.
Absolutely. All right. That will do it for this episode of the card. This is part 2 is done. We will see you next week. Not sure exactly what we're going to do for the card next week. Me and Tony will talk about it, but we will see you. Next Tuesday, we'll drop part 1. Part 2 will be on Thursday. We'll do it the same way again. Though if you watch the full episode of the Buckle Bomb show that drops on Sunday before, the entire thing will be on there. All right. That'll do it for the card. We'll see you later.
The preceding announcement has been paid for by Bomb Media Production.